It was the kind of town that looked like it belonged on the cover of a postcard. Nestled deep in Maine, its streets were lined with white fences, brick churches with tall steeples, and homes that had been passed down through generations. On the surface, it was quiet, safe, and predictable. Neighbors waved at one another, children played in yards, and old couples sat on their porches to watch the world pass by. To the casual eye, it was everything you might expect from small-town America. But beneath that polished image, behind closed doors and beneath carefully hidden family histories, there lurked a darkness so disturbing, so unnatural, that when the truth finally came to light, it would stain the entire town's legacy. This is the story of a man who lived in that quiet town, a man who at first glance seemed like everyone else. He was not famous, not rich, not someone who stood out. He went to work, attended gatherings, and carried himself with the same kind of routine normalcy that kept him invisible in plain sight. If you had seen him walking down the street, you wouldn't have looked twice, but hidden behind his ordinary smile was a truth so grotesque that when people discovered it, they wondered how they had ever missed the signs. Because this man married not once, not twice, but 3 times. And all 3 of his wives shared one horrifying detail. They were his cousins. At first, it sounded like gossip, the kind of unbelievable rumor small towns are notorious for creating. Whispers passed between neighbors in grocery store aisles, fragments of the story traded in hushed tones at church gatherings, mothers leaning toward each other on porches, lowering their voices as children played nearby. "Did you hear?" someone would say, almost disbelieving the words themselves. All 3 of his wives were family, his cousins. The other person would shake their head, half laughing, half afraid, unsure whether to dismiss it as nonsense or let the chill settle in their bones. But rumors have roots, and like weeds breaking through the cracks of an old foundation, this rumor had truth buried deep within it. For many, marriage is a symbol of love, of creating something new, a future uniting 2 families. But for this man, marriage never left the boundaries of the family tree. His story wasn't about love as most people understood it. It was about obsession, secrecy, and choices that turned a simple tree of genealogy into something warped, twisted, and sickening to look at. Imagine a tree in the forest, its branches curling backward, wrapping around themselves, strangling their own growth instead of stretching outward toward the sun. That was his family's tree. How does a man come to live such a life? How does he stand before the community, introduce his wife, smile at neighbors, and hide the reality that she is also his blood? To understand him, you must understand the silence of his family, the legacy of secrets that stretched back long before his own lifetime. Families can carry shadows the way houses carry dust. Layer by layer it settles until no one remembers the shine that once existed underneath. In his family, the shadows were heavy, filled with patterns of secrecy, denial, and an unspoken agreement to never ask the questions that might tear the facade apart. From the outside, his first marriage raised no alarms. People saw a young couple and congratulated them, believing it to be a normal beginning to a long, shared life. The whispers hadn't started yet. Few even bothered to connect their last names or trace their shared history. After all, cousins often grow up around each other in small towns, and closeness doesn't always mean anything unusual. But closeness in this case meant something very different. Behind the vows and the smiles at the wedding, the truth was already twisted into the fabric of the relationship. She was his cousin, and the family knew it. The second marriage came later, after tragedy and struggle. And by then, the whispers began to grow louder. Another cousin, another wedding that should have been a celebration, but instead stirred an uneasy feeling in those who were paying attention. Some ignored it, dismissing it as coincidence, as if pretending made it less real. Others avoided speaking about it altogether because to name the truth out loud was to admit just how horrifying it was. And yet, he continued, repeating the cycle. By the time of his third marriage, the truth could no longer be disguised as chance. This wasn't an accident. It was a choice. And so people began to wonder. What was it that drove him to do this? Was it desperation? Was it a family tradition carried on in the shadows, something never spoken of but silently expected? Or was it an obsession, a darkness unique to him, twisting his understanding of love and marriage until it became something almost unrecognizable? The answers were hidden, buried beneath years of denial and the carefully crafted facade of normalcy. But as with all secrets, cracks began to form, and once the cracks appeared, the entire truth threatened to spill out. The family tree, when traced, revealed connections that shocked even those who thought they had heard everything. Cousins marrying cousins, generations of relationships folded in on themselves, creating a pattern that seemed less like coincidence and more like a curse. And in the middle of that web stood this man who had bound himself not to strangers, not to outsiders, but to blood. Over and over again, he pulled from the same poisoned well, and each time the water grew darker. Neighbors began to look differently at the house where he lived, the place where family gatherings had taken place, where weddings had once seemed joyful. They started to wonder what else had been hidden behind those doors, what other truths had been buried under silence. A home that once looked ordinary now seemed heavy with shadows, its windows staring out like unblinking eyes. The laughter that once echoed from it was replaced in memory by whispers and unease. It's easy to look at such a story from the outside and ask, why didn't anyone stop it? But families like his thrive on silence. They build walls of denial, reinforced by shame and fear of judgment. Each generation tells itself that it's better to keep things hidden, better to pretend that nothing unusual is happening. And so, the cycle continues until one man's choices shine such a horrifying light that the darkness can no longer hide. This is not a story about love. This is not a story about tragedy alone. This is about the dangers of silence, about how secrets can rot a family from the inside out until their tree no longer resembles anything natural. And though this story takes place in Maine, it is not confined to Maine. Stories like this are hidden in many towns, behind many doors, waiting for the moment when the truth finally demands to be seen. And as you hear the story unfold, ask yourself, how well do you really know the people who live around you? How deep do the roots of their family trees run? And how many secrets are hidden in the soil beneath them? Because for this man, the roots of his tree were tangled, poisonous, and impossible to escape. Every story has a beginning, but not every beginning reveals the ending that waits in the shadows. For this man, the path that led him to marry not one. But three cousins didn't start with a shocking revelation. It started quietly, in childhood. In the very places where family gatherings blurred the lines between relatives and companions. Small-town life in Maine often meant that families lived close, sometimes only a few streets apart. Cousins played together, ate together, and grew up like siblings. No one questioned the closeness because in the eyes of the community, it was harmless. But closeness has a way of planting seeds, and some seeds grow into things no one expects. When he was young, he was often seen surrounded by family. Sunday dinners at his grandparents' home were crowded, filled with laughter, clinking dishes, and long tables where cousins sat shoulder to shoulder. The smell of baked bread and roasted meat filled the air, and stories from older generations echoed around the table. To an outsider, it looked warm, comforting, the perfect picture of tradition. But within those walls, something else was happening. While others saw cousins, he began to see something different. The lines that should have been clear, the boundaries that separate family from romance, blurred in ways that would shape his entire future. It is said that the first love often defines a person's idea of what love should be. For him, that first love was not a girl from another town, not a stranger he met in school, but a cousin he had known all his life. She was familiar, safe, already connected by blood. In the silence of those family gatherings, glances lingered longer than they should. Innocent games turned into something heavier, something whispered and hidden. The family didn't speak about it, or perhaps they chose not to see it. And so, what should have been a fleeting crush, a boundary quickly corrected by elders, grew, unchecked in the shadows of denial. Years passed, and what began in whispers became reality. His first marriage took place quietly, without grandeur. The community congratulated him, perhaps suspecting but unwilling to speak. People told themselves it was not unusual, that cousins sometimes married in history, that maybe this was simply an odd but acceptable choice. After all, Maine had its share of traditions, and not all of them were spoken of in polite company. But those who looked closer felt a chill, a quiet recognition that this was the start of something far darker. Their marriage at first seemed ordinary. Neighbors saw them shopping for groceries, walking hand in hand, appearing at local events. Smiles were shared, and to those who didn't know the truth, they looked like any young couple. But underneath the smiles, there were cracks. A marriage built on secrecy is never truly solid. The weight of what they were hiding pressed down on them like an invisible storm. And when tragedy struck, when illness and arguments chipped away at their lives, the foundation crumbled faster than anyone expected. It wasn't long before whispers began again. "She's his cousin," someone would mutter in disbelief. "Their blood." And while some defended them, insisting that family ties were not uncommon in generations past, others shook their heads, disgusted. The marriage didn't last, but it left a mark that would not fade. It was only the beginning of a pattern that would repeat itself in ways no one could have imagined. After the collapse of the first marriage, many thought perhaps he had learned that maybe he would step away from the path he had chosen. But obsession is not so easily broken. It was as though his mind had been wired to return to the same roots, unable to seek love outside the boundaries of his own bloodline. And so, when the second marriage came, it shocked those who knew the truth but left the rest of the community in denial. By now, people began asking questions. Why? Why would he do this again? Was it desperation, a refusal to look beyond the walls of his own family for companionship? Or was it something deeper, something darker, an inability to separate love from blood? Families carry patterns, legacies that shape even the choices of those who believe themselves free. His family tree was not one of healthy branches, but of twisted limbs curling back into themselves, and he was repeating those patterns, unable or unwilling to break free. The second marriage was quieter than the first, almost secretive. There was less celebration, fewer smiles. Those who attended carried a heaviness in their eyes, as though they knew they were witnessing something unnatural, but could do nothing to stop it. The bride was again a cousin, another piece of the same tangled web. By this time, those who once excused the first marriage as a strange coincidence could no longer ignore the truth. This was deliberate. This was a choice. As the years went by, his life became a paradox. Outwardly, he worked, he lived, he played his part in the community, but inside his home, behind the walls where no one could see, he was living a life built on a horrifying reality. The second marriage, like the first, carried with it the weight of secrecy and shame. The silence grew heavier, suffocating. And still, he did not stop. The third marriage came after the second had ended, and by then, the whispers had turned into full conversations. Neighbors who once looked away could no longer pretend not to know. "Another cousin," they said. shaking their heads, unable to believe it. 3 wives, all family, how is that possible? The story had left the boundaries of gossip and become a stain on the town's history. For some, it was a scandal. For others, it was a horror story they told in low voices, a warning of what silence can create. What makes this story chilling is not only the marriages themselves, but the way they reveal something deeper about human nature. The boundaries that society builds, the lines we are taught never to cross, are not as strong as we believe. When secrecy replaces honesty, when silence replaces confrontation, the forbidden can creep in quietly until it becomes almost normal. That is what happened here. What should have been unthinkable became routine, repeated 3 times without breaking. The man's life became a mirror, reflecting not only his own choices, but the choices of those around him. Families who kept quiet, neighbors who looked away, a community that chose not to ask too many questions. Each silence was another thread in the web, another reason the story was allowed to continue. And by the time the truth could no longer be denied, it was too late to undo what had already been done. His family tree was no longer a tree at all. It was something twisted, gnarled, a shape that bent in on itself so many times that it barely resembled the natural form it should have taken. And at the center of it all stood this man, the figure whose choices turned a quiet Maine town into the backdrop of one of the most horrifying family stories ever told. And yet, this is only the beginning. To truly understand how he could marry, not 1, not 2, but 3 of his cousins, you have to go deeper, into the roots of his family, into the shadows of traditions unspoken, into the silence that grew louder with every passing year. Because horror doesn't appear all at once. It creeps in slowly, weaving itself into lives until it feels almost ordinary. That is the true terror of this story. The past never disappears. It lingers, hidden in photographs tucked away in drawers, in stories whispered between elders, in traditions carried forward without question. To understand how one man in Maine came to marry not just 1 cousin but 3, we must step back into the soil of the family tree itself. Because his choices were not born in isolation. They were the rotten fruit of roots that had been poisoned long before his birth. Generations earlier, his family had already begun weaving a web of secrecy. In small rural towns, where families lived close together and bloodlines overlapped, cousins often grew up side by side. Proximity bred familiarity, and familiarity blurred the natural distance that should have existed between relatives. While most families drew boundaries, his did not. Instead, they built walls of silence, refusing to confront what they saw. The first cracks in the tree were never spoken of. They were ignored, patched over with denial. And denial, when repeated long enough, becomes tradition. It began with marriages that were convenient. A cousin marrying a cousin meant land stayed in the family, inheritance stayed unbroken, and trust remained within known circles. What outsiders might have questioned, his family rationalized as practical. They told themselves it was survival, a way to keep wealth, property, and loyalty contained. But with each cousin marriage, the branches of the tree curved inward, tighter and tighter, creating a pattern that would one day collapse under its own weight. The elders never admitted it openly. They spoke of love, of fate, of family bonds, too strong to ignore. But behind their words was an unspoken rule: keep it inside. Do not bring strangers into the bloodline. Do not risk what is ours. This silence was passed down like an inheritance, one more valuable than land, one more powerful than wealth. Children grew up watching it, absorbing it, never realizing how unnatural it truly was. When the man at the center of our story was born, he entered a family already marked by these choices. His grandparents had shared more than just family ties. His great-uncles and aunts had married within the family tree as well. It was not unusual in their world. It was not questioned. It was simply how things had been done. And so, from the very beginning, he inherited not only their blood, but their silence, their warped understanding of what love and marriage should mean. As a boy, he played in the same yards, attended the same gatherings, shared meals at long tables, where everyone was related by some thread or another. He did not have to look outward for connection. Connection was always close, always within reach, and always reinforced by the watchful eyes of elders who, while never speaking of it, allowed the pattern to continue. In his young mind, there was no difference between seeking love outside or inside the family. The boundaries had already been erased before he even knew they existed. Generations of silence create heavy shadows. His family carried stories they refused to tell, marriages they pretended were normal, and consequences they buried deep. Some children were born frail, others sickly. Whispers about weak blood circulated quietly, but no one dared connect the dots. To do so would be to admit that their choices were not simply odd, they were dangerous. And so the silence continued, heavier with each passing year. In the community, the family was respected. They owned land, worked hard, and appeared at church on Sundays like everyone else. Outsiders saw them as strong, united, deeply connected. Few realized that this very connection was the source of their darkest secret. In truth, the respect they earned in public became another shield, protecting them from scrutiny, allowing them to continue their traditions without interference. Who would question a family so involved in the community? Who would accuse them of something so unthinkable? The man grew up surrounded by these unspoken rules. When he reached the age where boys begin to notice girls, his world was already shaped by silence. Cousins were not off limits. In fact, they were his first companions, his first crushes, the ones he trusted most. By the time he fell in love for the first time, the path was already laid out for him. He would never have to look beyond the twisted branches of his own family tree. But this was more than inherited silence. There was also fear. His family had built such strong walls around themselves that breaking the pattern seemed impossible. Those who questioned it risked isolation. And in a town where reputation mattered more than anything, silence was safer than truth. So the man did what those before him had done. He accepted the silence, embraced the pattern, and followed the path laid before him. The most horrifying part of this story is not only the man's marriages. It is the realization that his choices were inevitable, almost destined, because no one before him had dared to stop the cycle. Each generation had passed down not just their blood but their silence until silence itself became a curse, and like all curses, it demanded a price. When the man married his first cousin, the elders did not object. Some nodded in approval, others looked away, but no one spoke against it. When he married his second cousin, there was still no confrontation. The silence was so deeply ingrained that even those who knew better chose to say nothing. And by the time he married his third, the silence had consumed everything. It is easy to look at the story now and feel disgust, to wonder how such a thing could happen in modern America. But history shows us that silence has always been the breeding ground for horror. When people refuse to confront the truth, when families value reputation over honesty, the unthinkable becomes reality. His story is not only about cousin marriages. It is about generations of denial that created a man who believed his choices were not only possible, but acceptable. Imagine the family tree on paper, each branch carefully drawn. At first it looks normal, parents, children, cousins. But then, the lines begin to fold back into each other, looping, twisting, collapsing. The further you trace, the less it looks like a tree and more like a knot, tangled and impossible to untie. That knot, was his inheritance. That knot became his life. By the time he was a man, he no longer questioned it. In his mind, love was not something found in strangers. It was something grown in familiarity, in the faces he had known since childhood. And so he continued, never realizing, or perhaps refusing to admit, that what he saw as love was in truth the poison of generations. The past may be buried, but it is never gone. His story is proof. Every choice he made was rooted in the choices of those who came before him. Every silence he kept was an echo of silences held by his parents, grandparents, and generations before them. And though he lived in the present, his life was haunted by the shadows of the past, by the legacy of a family that had forgotten how to grow outward, how to break free from its own tangled roots. This is why his marriages were not simply mistakes. They were the inevitable conclusion of a story that began long before he was born. A story of silence, denial, and choices left unchecked for far too long. And though the man would one day be remembered for the horror of his 3 cousin wives, the truth is that his story was only the latest chapter in a book written generations ago. And as we continue, the question remains, how far back does the silence go? How many secrets lie buried in the soil of his family's past? Because until we uncover the roots, we cannot truly understand the horror of the tree that grew from them. Marriage, for most people, is supposed to be the start of something hopeful, a promise of love, a future built together, a chance to escape the loneliness of the world. For him, his first marriage carried all those illusions. To the community, it looked like any young couple beginning their life together. But behind the smiles, behind the carefully arranged photographs and polite greetings, there was already something broken. Because his first wife was not just his partner. She was his blood, his cousin. At the wedding, some whispered. They noticed the familiar family resemblance, the shared last names, the way the family tree bent back into itself with this union. But most chose silence. Some excused it, telling themselves that such things had happened in the past, that maybe it was not as unusual as it seemed. Others knew better, but feared the weight of speaking out. So the wedding went on, the vows were exchanged, and the silence grew heavier. In the early years, their life together looked almost ordinary. They moved into a modest home, a small house with peeling paint and a garden she tried to keep alive in the short Maine summers. From the outside, it was the picture of simplicity. He worked long hours, she kept the home, and neighbors saw them shopping together at the market or walking side by side on quiet evenings. If you didn't know their secret, you would have thought they were just another couple building a life. But the truth was never far away. Every time they introduced themselves, every time someone new asked how they knew each other, the shadow of their relationship lingered in the air. They had answers ready, explanations rehearsed, but the unease never disappeared. She carried it in her eyes, in the nervous smile that never quite reached her face. He carried it in his silence, in the way he avoided conversations that might lead too close to the truth. In private, their marriage was strained. It is difficult to build love when it is born from secrecy. Arguments came quickly, small disagreements that turned into heavy silences. She wanted a future free of whispers, a chance to live without the weight of their family watching. But he was bound, not just to her, but to the legacy of silence he had inherited. When she spoke of moving, of leaving the town behind, he refused. The roots of his family were too deep, and he could not imagine life outside their twisted tree. Children became a question they could not escape. Friends asked when they would start a family. Relatives, even those who knew the truth, pressured them with smiles that hid their discomfort. She wanted children, desperately, but the thought of bringing new life into a bloodline already tangled by generations of silence terrified her. At night, she cried quietly, fearing what might happen if they dared to grow their family. He dismissed her fears, telling her it was natural, telling her it was fate. But deep down, even he must have known the risk. Their love, if it had ever been pure, began to rot under the weight of these fears. Rumors outside the home grew louder. People in town whispered about their marriage, some cruel, some sympathetic. "She's his cousin," they said, shaking their heads. The whispers reached her ears, each one a dagger cutting deeper into her sense of self. She began to feel trapped, caught between love and shame, unable to break free but unable to endure the life she had chosen. The collapse came slowly, like a house decaying from the inside. Small cracks widened into chasms. Days of silence stretched into weeks. She grew distant, spending hours alone, staring out windows, avoiding the neighbors she once greeted with polite smiles. He grew angrier, frustrated by her withdrawal, unable to accept that their love was not enough to silence the world outside. Their home became a prison of quiet resentment, the walls closing in tighter with every passing day. When tragedy finally struck, it was not a single moment, but a series of losses that broke them. Illness swept through their home, leaving her weakened, fragile, unable to carry the weight of their marriage. Friends noticed her absence from gatherings, the way she seemed thinner, her smile gone. Some whispered that it was guilt eating her alive, others said it was despair. Whatever the truth, she was fading, and he could do nothing to stop it. The arguments became crueler in those final months. He clung to her, desperate to hold on to what they had, while she pushed him away, suffocating under the weight of their shared secret. Their love had turned into a chain, binding them together in misery. She spoke of leaving, of escaping the shadow of their family, but he could not allow it. His obsession, his refusal to see beyond the walls of blood, kept him chained to her, even as their marriage crumbled. The end came quietly. There was no dramatic outburst, no violent conclusion. Instead, there was silence. A silence so heavy it seemed to swallow the house whole. Neighbors noticed the change, the curtains drawn, the lights dim, the once lively home now cold and lifeless. And then one day she was simply gone. Some say she left, unable to bear the weight any longer. Others say illness claimed her, that her body finally gave out under the strain of despair. Whatever the truth, she was gone, and the marriage was over. He was left alone, standing in the ruins of a love that had never truly been free. The house echoed with her absence, the walls heavy with memories of arguments, tears, and silence. To the town, it was a tragedy. Some pitied him, others judged him, but all agreed that his marriage had been doomed from the start. How could love survive when it was built on blood and secrecy? For most men, such a collapse would have been the end. A warning, a lesson never to repeat the same mistake. But for him, it was only the beginning. Instead of turning away from the tangled roots of his family tree, he dug deeper. Instead of learning from the pain of his first marriage, he repeated it. Twice more. His obsession, his blindness, his inability to escape the silence of his family drove him further down the path of horror. The story of his first wife is not just a tragedy of love lost. It is a warning about the power of silence, the way unspoken truths can destroy from within. She became a casualty of a legacy she never chose, a victim of a family that valued secrecy over honesty. And though her name may be forgotten in the whispers of time, her story remains carved into the dark history of Maine, a reminder that some marriages are doomed before they even begin. And for him, her absence did not end the cycle. It only left a void he would try to fill again and again with the same poisoned bloodline. Their marriage began under heavier shadows than the first two. The house they shared was already burdened with the ghosts of the past, with the absence of the women who came before. She stepped into a life haunted by tragedy, carrying the impossible weight of trying to succeed where others had failed. He demanded loyalty, obedience, silence, more so than ever before. She tried to give it, tried to make their life ordinary, but ordinary had long ago become impossible. The community was relentless. Where whispers once faded into silence, they now grew louder, bolder. Children whispered at school. Neighbors spoke. Openly, church sermons hinted at sin without naming names. The scandal had spread beyond the town, carried by gossip into neighboring communities. His name was no longer just known. It was infamous, and his wife bore the brunt of it. Everywhere she went, she felt the weight of eyes on her, the sting of judgment in every glance. People who once greeted her with kindness now avoided her, unwilling to be associated with the scandal. She grew isolated, retreating further into the walls of their home, and soon even that home began to feel like a cage. Inside, the marriage followed the same tragic pattern. The first months held a fragile hope, but cracks soon appeared. He grew, controlling, demanding, bitter from years of judgment. She grew restless, haunted by whispers she could not silence. Their arguments echoed through the house, sharp and venomous, each one a reminder that they were not building a future. They were repeating a cycle. Children again became the unspoken question. She wanted them, but fear stopped her. The family tree was already poisoned, its roots twisted beyond repair. What future could a child have in such a legacy? He dismissed her worries as he always had, insisting that their blood was their strength, that outsiders would never understand. But deep down, even he must have known the truth. Each marriage had ended in collapse, each wife consumed by despair. Why should this be any different? The scandal reached its peak in those years. Newspapers began to whisper about the family, articles hinting at the strange unions that had shocked a small Maine town. Outsiders began to ask questions. How could this happen 3 times? Why did no one stop him? Why did the community stay silent? The story spread like wildfire, and for the first time the silence that had protected him began to crumble. His third wife lived under this storm, caught between the fury of the outside world and the suffocating control inside her home. Some say she tried to run, that she packed her things one night and prepared to leave. Others claim she never made it out, that her attempts at freedom were crushed by his obsession. Whatever the truth, her life followed the same tragic path as the others. She too disappeared from the story, swallowed by the same silence that had claimed the first and second wives. For him, the scandal did not bring shame. It brought a strange kind of pride. He became almost defiant, wearing his choices like armor, daring anyone to confront him. "It's my family," he would say, "it's my blood." To him, the whispers were not condemnation but proof of his strength. Where others saw tragedy, he saw legacy. Where others saw shame, he saw destiny. But destiny has a way of turning on those who believe too strongly in it. The scandal left scars not only on his reputation, but on the entire community. Families moved away, children grew up haunted by the story, and his name became a curse spoken only in hushed tones. His third marriage did not bring him happiness, did not redeem him, did not silence the whispers. It only confirmed the horror of his family tree. 3 wives, 3 cousins, 3 tragedies. By the end, he stood alone again, surrounded not by love, but by silence, not by family, but by ghosts. His life had become a warning, his choices a shadow over the town that could never quite be erased. The story of his third wife is the darkest of them all, not because it was different, but because it was the same cycle, the same despair, the same collapse. By then, it was no longer a mistake. It was a pattern. It was horror woven into the very roots of his bloodline, a horror no one could deny. And so, the legacy of silence continued, leaving behind not love, not family, but a horrifying reminder of what happens when blood becomes obsession. Families often carry secrets. Some are small, forgotten over time, whispered only in passing. Others are darker, heavier, shaping entire generations with their silence. His family's secrets were of the second kind. The roots of his story did not begin with him, or even with his marriages. They stretched back through decades of silence, through ancestors who made choices no one dared to question, through a legacy built not on love, but on blood, and on the fear of letting outsiders in. The town had always known something was different about his family. Long before his first marriage, people noticed the way their gatherings seemed closed off, how weddings rarely involved outsiders, how the family kept to itself in ways that felt unnatural. Neighbors whispered that they preferred their own, that their pride in bloodlines was more than just tradition. Over time, those whispers hardened into suspicion. Why did their family tree look more like a circle than a branch? Why did so many of their faces resemble one another so closely? The truth was simple and horrifying. Generations of his family had practiced silence and secrecy, choosing cousins over strangers, blood over love. They told themselves it was strength, that keeping the family pure protected their legacy. But purity, when twisted into obsession, becomes poison. What began as tradition had become a curse. Old records hinted at it, marriage certificates that tied cousins together, baptism papers where the same surnames repeated again and again. The church had known, the neighbors had known, but no one had spoken. Silence had been easier. Confrontation would have meant tearing apart a family that seemed too proud, too powerful to question. And so the silence grew, passed down like an heirloom, until it became as natural as breathing. His parents had been part of it. Their marriage, too, carried the stain of secrecy. They had raised him in a home where blood came before all else, where family was not just important, but absolute. He was taught to believe that outsiders could not be trusted, that love should never leave the circle of their name. By the time he was old enough to understand the world, the cycle had already been imprinted on him. To him, it was not wrong. It was destiny. Some in the family tried to resist. There were cousins who left town, who married outside, who broke the silence. But they were shunned, cut off, their names spoken with bitterness. They betrayed the blood, his relatives would say, shaking their heads. And so the lesson was clear. Loyalty meant staying within. Silence meant survival. The cost of this silence was everywhere if you looked closely. Children born weak, illnesses that lingered, tragedies that struck without explanation. Neighbors noticed, but they did not speak. Doctors noticed, but their warnings were ignored. And still the cycle continued. One cousin after another, one marriage after another, until he came of age, and followed the path laid out for him. What made his story horrifying was not just the choices he made, but the way those choices had been prepared for him. His 3 marriages to his cousins were not accidents of love, but inevitabilities of a family that had buried the truth for too long. He was both a victim and a villain, shaped by the silence of his ancestors and yet responsible for repeating it. By the time of his 3rd marriage, the town could no longer look away. Outsiders had begun to ask questions, and the family's legacy of secrecy was harder to defend. But still, many remained silent. They told themselves it was not their place, that families had a right to their own traditions. And so, even as the scandal grew, the cycle was allowed to continue, because silence is powerful, and fear of speaking the truth can bind people more tightly than any chain. The generational curse of his family was not written in blood alone, but in silence, in the refusal to confront what everyone already knew. He was simply the most visible product of that legacy, the one whose story was too large, too horrifying to ignore. His 3 wives, each his cousin, were not isolated tragedies but chapters in a much longer book, written long before he was born. The roots of horror are rarely sudden. They grow slowly, quietly, feeding on secrets, watered by silence. His family's tree was proof of that, and by the time anyone dared to look closely, the roots had grown too deep, the branches too twisted, the fruit too poisoned to ever be undone. And so the question remains, was he the architect of his own downfall, or just another victim of a legacy that had trapped him before he ever took his first breath? The truth, like his family's secrets, may never be fully known. But what is certain is this: the horror did not begin with him, and it did not end with him. It was a story generations in the making, passed down through silence, until it consumed them all. For years, silence had been the shield. It had protected him, it had protected his family. It had allowed the horror of 3 marriages to cousins to unfold without interruption. Neighbors whispered, relatives looked away, and the town told itself that it was not their place to interfere. But silence can only last so long. Eventually it begins to crack. Eventually the weight of truth becomes too heavy to ignore. Grief changes people. For some it softens the heart, teaching them to value what they once took for granted. For others, it hardens them, leaving scars that never truly heal. But for him, grief did something stranger. After the collapse of his first marriage, after the whispers and the tragedy that lingered in the air like a shadow, he did not turn away from the path that had led him there. He walked further into it. Instead of seeing the mistakes, the shame, the warning signs, he repeated them. And so, the second marriage began. When he first appeared in public with her, people already knew. They didn't need introductions, didn't need explanations. They recognized her face, the familiar resemblance, the blood that tied them together. Another cousin, another branch of the family tree curling back onto itself. For those who whispered about his first marriage, this was confirmation of something darker. Once might have been a mistake, twice was a choice. The community responded in divided ways. Some shrugged it off, claiming it was his private life, his right to choose whom he loved. Others shook their heads in disgust, whispering that it was unnatural, wrong, a sickness that should never have been allowed to happen once, let alone again. But beneath every opinion, there was a single truth everyone shared: silence. No one spoke loudly enough to stop him. No one confronted the family. The whispers grew, but the silence still protected him. His second wife entered the marriage with hope, or at least the appearance of it. She was younger, eager for stability, convinced that love could grow even in the strangest of places. Perhaps she believed she could be the one to change him, to turn their marriage into something real, something untangled from the shadows. Or perhaps she was caught in the same web of silence that had trapped generations before her, unable to see a way out. Whatever the reason, she said yes, and the cycle continued. The wedding itself was smaller, quieter than the first. There were fewer smiles, fewer guests, and the weight of judgment hung heavy in the air. Some relatives attended reluctantly, their faces stiff, their conversations brief. Others stayed away, unwilling to witness what they considered a mistake. The silence of approval had thinned into silence of shame, but it was still silence all the same. In the early days, their life together seemed more hopeful than his first marriage. They moved into a slightly larger home, with space enough for dreams of a family. She decorated the rooms, planted flowers by the door, and tried to create a life that looked ordinary. Neighbors saw her tending the garden, waving politely, and some even tried to convince themselves that maybe this marriage would succeed where the first had failed. But deep down, everyone knew the truth. The foundation was cracked before the house was even built. Inside their home, the cracks widened. Quickly, his grief from the first marriage lingered like a ghost, haunting every corner. He carried anger with him, frustration at the whispers that followed them, bitterness at the way the community judged him. She, in turn, carried her own fears. She had heard the rumors before she married him. She knew the history. And though she tried to believe they could outrun it, every time someone looked at her too long, every time a neighbor lowered their voice when she entered a room, she was reminded of the truth. She was not only his wife, she was his cousin. Arguments became a constant presence in their home. He wanted obedience, loyalty, silence. She wanted freedom, a chance to live without the suffocating weight of shame. She spoke of moving, of leaving, the town where everyone knew their secret, but like before, he refused. His roots were too deep, his obsession too strong. The family tree had him in its grip, and he could not imagine life beyond its twisted branches. Children again became a subject they could not escape. Friends and family asked, neighbors hinted, and even strangers sometimes made comments. She longed for a child, but she feared the consequences. She had seen the frailty in some of their relatives, the whispers about weak blood. Late at night, she confessed her fears, begged him to understand. But he dismissed her, insisting that love was enough, that fate would decide. His refusal to see the danger pushed them further apart, turning love into resentment, hope into despair. As time passed, the community grew less forgiving. Whispers turned into open judgment. Some parents warned their children to stay away from the family, afraid of the darkness that seemed to follow them. Others gossiped more loudly, no longer caring if the couple overheard. The second marriage had not only trapped them in silence, but had made them targets of ridicule. Every time they stepped outside, they carried the weight of the town's eyes on their shoulders. Her isolation grew unbearable. She stopped attending gatherings, stopped smiling at neighbors, stopped tending the garden she had once planted with care. The flowers by the door withered, the curtains stayed drawn, and their home became another silent prison. She spent hours alone, lost in thought, her dreams of a normal life collapsing under the reality she had chosen. He, meanwhile, grew more bitter, lashing out in anger, blaming her for their unhappiness, blaming the world for its judgment, but never blaming himself. The collapse of the second marriage was slower, more painful than the first. It was not marked by a single tragedy, but by the gradual erosion of everything that once resembled love. Day by day their connection crumbled. Nights were filled with arguments, days with silence. The house that once seemed full of promise became heavy with despair, its walls echoing with unspoken words. Eventually, she could no longer endure it. Some say she left, walking away from the life she had built, unwilling to spend another day in the shadows. Others say illness claimed her too, that her body, like his first wife's, gave out under the strain of secrecy and shame. The truth is uncertain, hidden behind the same silence that defined their lives. What is known is that she was gone, and the marriage was over. For the town, it was confirmation of what they already believed. It was doomed, they said. It could never have lasted. The whispers grew louder, spreading beyond the town, turning into a story told in hushed voices, a cautionary tale about what happens when silence replaces truth. His reputation was stained, his family's name tainted, and yet he did not stop. Where most men would have learned, he repeated the cycle again. Where most would have turned away, he dug deeper into the twisted roots of his family tree. His second marriage ended not with lessons learned, but with obsession reinforced. He had married another cousin, lived another tragedy, and walked away, more determined than ever to continue. The second wife became another casualty, another victim of silence, another branch broken from the poisoned tree. Her story was swallowed by whispers, her name forgotten, her life reduced to a footnote in the town's dark history. And he, the man at the center of it all, prepared to do it again, as though the past had taught him nothing. 3 times he would marry. 3 times he would repeat the same mistake. And with each marriage, the horror of his family tree grew darker, heavier, impossible to ignore. The story of his second wife is not only a tragedy of love lost, but a mirror reflecting the danger of repeating the past. She believed, perhaps, that love could overcome the shadows. She believed she could escape the whispers. But silence, once inherited, is not so easily broken. She too was consumed by it, leaving behind another scar on the family's legacy. And for him, her absence was not the end. It was only another chapter in a story that had already gone too far. By the time he entered his 3rd marriage, the whispers had become more than whispers. They were no longer confined to hushed conversations behind closed doors or murmurs exchanged at church gatherings. They had grown into a scandal, a stain on the community's conscience, a story so outrageous that it could no longer be ignored. 1 marriage to a cousin had been unsettling, 2 had been shocking. But 3 was something else entirely. It was a declaration, a defiance, a man standing in full view of the world and saying he did not care. When the townspeople first heard, disbelief turned quickly into anger. They muttered that he had lost his mind, that his family was cursed, that his bloodline was poisoned beyond redemption. Some laughed cruelly, others spoke of sin, but all agreed that this was no ordinary man. This was a man bound to a twisted legacy, a man whose obsession had consumed him so completely that he could not escape it, even if he tried. His 3rd wife was younger still, another cousin drawn into the web of silence that had trapped the others. Perhaps she thought herself different, thought that she could build something lasting where the first 2 had failed. Or perhaps she was simply swept along by the weight of expectation, the force of a family that had learned to bury its shame instead of confronting it. Whatever her reasons, she agreed, and with that agreement, the final act of his dark trilogy began. The wedding was small, almost secretive, but it could not escape the scandal. People watched from afar, their faces twisted with judgment. Invitations had been refused, neighbors stayed away, and even some relatives who once kept their silence finally turned their backs. The air was thick with condemnation, but he seemed unfazed. If anything, he carried himself with even greater pride, as though marrying a 3rd cousin wife was not a shameful act, but a statement of defiance. The scandal of his 3rd marriage was the breaking point. Where before the whispers had been confined to back rooms and hushed corners of the church, they now spilled out into the open. People no longer cared if he overheard, no longer worried about offending the family. They had seen enough. 3 marriages, 3 wives, 3 cousins. For many, it was not only disturbing, it was horrifying. And horror has a way of shaking people from silence. It began with small acts of defiance. Neighbors stopped waving when he passed by. Shopkeepers refused to greet him politely, their eyes lingering with quiet judgment as he bought his groceries. Children, once told to be polite, now mocked him openly, repeating the words they had heard their parents whisper late at night. His family name, once spoken with a mixture of respect and unease, became a curse, a punchline, a warning, but whispers and cold shoulders were not enough. Soon voices began to rise. At community meetings, townspeople spoke, carefully at first, then with growing boldness, about the family's history. They asked questions that had long been buried. Why was this allowed to happen? Why did no one speak up? How could a man marry 3 of his own cousins right here in our town without anyone stopping him? The questions were not only about him, but about themselves, about the community's failure to act. The church, once complicit in silence, began to crack as well. Sermons grew sharper, the language more pointed. Sin was named without naming names, but everyone knew who the words were meant for. Some members of the congregation turned their heads uncomfortably, while others nodded fiercely, their patience finally broken. And in those pews, his wives, whether gone by death, despair, or silence, were remembered as victims, their stories reclaimed by those who had once ignored them. The scandal spread beyond the town. Local papers began to write, cautiously at first, then with full force. Headlines hinted at family horrors and marriages too close for comfort. The story traveled, picked up by outsiders who could not believe such things had been allowed to happen in Maine in modern times. What had once been whispered in private was now printed in ink for all to read. The family's secrets were no longer secrets, they were public property, and with exposure came shame. His name was dragged through conversations in neighboring towns, mocked in taverns, whispered in classrooms. Strangers pointed when he walked by. His home, once an ordinary house with peeling paint, became a landmark of scandal, a place parents warned their children to avoid. The silence that had once protected him now worked against him, for every corner of quiet seemed filled with whispers too loud to ignore. His own relatives began to fracture. Some stood by him, clinging to the same silence that had defined them for generations. Others broke away, distancing themselves, insisting they had nothing to do with his choices. The family, once united in secrecy, was now divided by scandal. Old feuds resurfaced, bitterness boiled over, and the family tree that had once twisted in on itself began to split apart under the pressure. For him, the rebellion of the community was unbearable. He had always thrived in silence, in the comfort of knowing no one would confront him directly. Now, everywhere he turned, there were eyes, voices, judgment. He grew more defiant, more bitter, lashing out at those who dared to speak. He accused the town of betrayal, of hypocrisy, of failing to understand the strength of blood. But his anger only fueled the flames. The more he spoke, the more the community pushed back. Some say he tried to rebuild, to hold on to his legacy by force of will. He still believed in the purity of his choices, still told himself that love was stronger than judgment. But others say he began to unravel, that the weight of scandal finally broke through his pride. He withdrew from public life, retreating into the crumbling silence of his home, where the ghosts of his 3 marriages haunted every room. The community, meanwhile, was left with scars of its own. Breaking silence is never clean. It left bitterness, shame, and anger in its wake. People asked themselves hard questions. How had they let this happen? How had their silence contributed to the tragedy? Mothers wondered if they could have spoken sooner. Fathers regretted the times they had looked away, and the younger generation, watching the scandal unfold, vowed never to repeat the mistakes of their elders. The aftermath of his scandal was not just about him. It was about the community that had allowed him to exist unchecked. His story became a symbol of silence's power and its danger. Teachers told it as a warning, parents used it as a lesson, and whispers that once protected him were replaced by open conversations meant to prevent another tragedy. But even in the rebellion, even in the breaking of silence, his presence lingered. His house stood as a grim reminder, his name as a shadow no one could quite escape. For some, he was a monster. For others, a victim of generational curses. But for all, he was unforgettable. The community's rebellion did not erase the horror. It did not bring back the women who had been lost to silence. It did not untangle the twisted roots of the family tree. But it was something. A beginning. A chance to acknowledge what had been hidden for too long. a promise that the next generation would not carry the same silence. And yet, in the quiet moments of the town, when the streets grew dark, when the wind howled through the trees, there was still a feeling that his story was not over, that the legacy of silence could not be so easily broken, that some roots grow too deep to ever truly be cut away. Loneliness is a strange thing. For some, it is quiet but bearable, like a shadow that follows without ever touching. For others, it is suffocating, pressing against the chest until every breath feels stolen. For him, loneliness became something else entirely. It was not just the absence of company. It was the presence of ghosts. Ghosts of wives lost, of whispers turned into shouts, of a community that had once stayed silent but now condemned him with every glance. After the scandal of his third marriage, his world shrank. The community no longer tolerated him. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid him. Shopkeepers pretended not to see him, their politeness replaced with cold indifference. Even those within his own family distanced themselves, some cutting ties entirely. Others lowering their voices when his name came up, as though he were already dead to them. He was no longer just a man. He was a curse. Inside his home, silence grew heavier than it had ever been. The rooms that once echoed with arguments, with footsteps, with the faint traces of life, now stood empty. Curtains stayed drawn, dust collected on forgotten furniture, and the air carried the heavy stillness of abandonment. He lived in that silence, pacing the floors, staring at walls, haunted by memories he could not escape. At night, he heard them, the laughter of his first wife before it soured into tears, the desperate pleas of his second, asking to leave, begging for a freedom he refused to grant, the quiet despair of his third, who had tried to survive but had been consumed by the scandal that surrounded her. Their voices were not real, but they were loud enough to keep him awake, whispering through the halls, echoing in his ears until he no longer knew if he was awake or dreaming. Guilt began to eat at him, but it was not the kind of guilt that leads to confession or redemption. It was poisonous, gnawing at him from the inside, twisting every thought. He told himself he had loved them, that his choices had been born of loyalty, of tradition, of destiny. But late at night, in the darkest hours, he wondered if he had destroyed them. If his obsession, his refusal to break free of the family's silence, had dragged them into despair. The line between guilt and paranoia blurred. He stopped trusting anyone. He believed the town was plotting against him, that the neighbors who once smiled were now conspiring to ruin him. Every laugh he overheard on the street was about him, every whisper a dagger aimed at his back. He shut himself away, convinced that the world outside his walls was hostile, that only within his decaying home could he find safety. But even there, the ghosts followed. His mental collapse deepened with each passing day. He stopped eating regularly, stopped caring for himself. His once proud defiance faded into muttering, pacing, speaking to people who were no longer there. Some nights, he wandered the streets aimlessly, disheveled, eyes wide with a haunted look that frightened those who saw him. Children dared each other to catch a glimpse of him, calling him a madman, a specter of the scandal that had cursed their town. Adults shook their heads, pity mixing uneasily with disgust. There were moments of clarity, brief and fleeting, when he tried to convince himself he could rebuild. He scribbled notes, made plans, spoke aloud to the empty room about starting over. But the plans never lasted. The notes turned to incoherent ramblings, the words to shouts directed at no one. His mind was unraveling thread by thread, until there was nothing left to hold it together. Some say he began keeping the belongings of his wives close, refusing to part with them. A dress folded neatly on a chair, a pair of shoes by the door, photographs hidden in drawers, taken out late at night and stared at for hours, whether out of love, Guilt or madness, no one could say. To him, they were still there, still part of his life, still haunting every corner of his existence. The community watched his decline from a distance. Some felt vindicated, seeing his collapse as justice for the horrors he had inflicted. Others pitied him, a man consumed by the very silence that had once protected him. But none stepped forward to help. He'd become untouchable, a symbol of everything they wanted to forget. His loneliness was complete, and so he lived in a house of shadows, surrounded not by family but by ghosts, not by love but by regret. His days blurred into nights, his nights into endless hours of pacing, muttering, staring into the dark. The man who once defied the world with pride was now broken, his mind fractured, his heart consumed by the weight of guilt he could neither accept nor escape. Loneliness had claimed him. Guilt had devoured him. Madness had finished what scandal had begun. And in the end, he was no longer the man who had married 3 wives, 3 cousins. He was simply a hollow shell, a warning, a figure lost to the echoes of his own choices. In the end, every story has a conclusion. But some conclusions do not bring peace. They do not heal wounds or offer redemption. They leave scars, reminders of choices that can never be undone. His story, 3 wives, 3 cousins, 3 tragedies, did not end with love, nor with forgiveness. It ended as it had always lived, in silence, in whispers, in horror too heavy to bury. The final days of his life are remembered differently by those who speak of them. Some say he wasted away quietly, retreating into himself until his body followed where his mind had already gone. Others whisper darker tales, that he raged against shadows only he could see, screaming at the ghosts of his wives, begging for forgiveness that never came. Whatever the truth, one thing is certain. He died alone, consumed not by the love he once claimed, but by the silence that had haunted him since birth. When the news of his death spread, the town reacted not with mourning, but with a strange mix of relief and unease. There was no funeral procession, no crowd of mourners lining the streets. His name, once whispered in scandal, was now spoken with finality. Some pitied him, others cursed him, but most simply shook their heads and said, it was bound to end that way. For them, his passing was not just the death of a man, but the closing of a chapter in their town's darkest history. His house stood empty for years after, a hollow monument to everything he had done. Windows boarded, paint peeling, weeds choking. The yard. It became a place children dared each other to approach, a place neighbors avoided after dark. They said you could still hear voices in its halls, whispers of arguments, the sobs of women trapped by blood and silence. Some swore they saw his shadow in the windows, staring out at a world that had finally rejected him. Whether ghost story or truth, it didn't matter. The house itself was a reminder, and in that reminder lived the horror of his legacy. But his story was larger than one man. It was a reflection of something deeper, something far more unsettling. His marriages were not accidents. They were the product of generations of silence, of a family that chose blood over truth, secrecy over honesty. The roots of his horror stretched back long before him, and the branches continued long after. He was both the product of his family and the warning of what silence can create. The community, too, bore its share of guilt. They had known. They had whispered. They had seen the signs in the family tree, in the marriages that came before. And yet they had chosen silence, convincing themselves it was not their place, that speaking would only cause trouble. By the time they broke that silence, it was too late. 3 wives had been lost, a man consumed by obsession, a family tree poisoned beyond repair. His legacy became a story told in hushed tones, then in classrooms, then in books, a cautionary tale about the dangers of secrecy. about the way silence can destroy just as surely as violence. Parents told their children, "Don't look away from what you know is wrong." Teachers reminded their students, "Some traditions are not worth preserving." And historians, when they spoke of him, used words like horror, tragedy, and curse. But beyond the lessons and the warnings, there was something else, a lingering unease, a sense that his story had not truly ended, because silence, once planted, has a way of growing back. Families, even those outside his, still carried secrets of their own. And in the quiet of night, when the wind howled through the town and the trees cast long shadows, people still asked themselves, how much of his legacy have we truly escaped? How much silence do we still carry in our own homes? His wives, the true victims of the story, were remembered in fragments. Their names faded, their lives reduced to whispers, but their suffering lingered. They were women who entered marriages they believed would give them stability, love, and belonging, only to be trapped in the suffocating silence of a family that saw them as branches, not individuals. Their stories were swallowed by his, their identities overshadowed by the scandal. And yet, in remembering him, the community could not help but remember them. For without their pain, his horror would have meant nothing. The legacy of his life was not love. It was not family. It was a warning. A warning about what happens when silence is allowed to rule, when blood becomes an obsession, when secrets are passed down instead of broken. His story was not just about him. It was about the community that enabled him, the family that shaped him, and the silence that consumed them all. Even today, his name lingers like a shadow in Maine's history, not written in bright headlines or honored in memorials, but whispered in corners, told in dark documentaries, spoken of as the man who married 3 cousins. His life has become folklore, a horror story dressed as truth, a reminder that sometimes reality is darker than fiction, and so his ending is not clean. It is not neat. It is not the kind of story that leaves you with hope. Instead, it leaves you with a question, echoing long after the words fade. How many horrors are we complicit in simply because we stay silent? That was his true legacy. Not the marriages, not the scandal, not even his lonely death. His legacy was silence, the silence that created him, protected him, destroyed him. The silence that turned a man's private choices into a community's public curse. The silence that, even after his death, still lingers in the air like a shadow that refuses to leave, because silence once born never truly dies.